We begin today's program on the Korean Peninsula. While the foreign ministers of Australia, India and Japan are doing their consultation, South Korea, the United States and Japan have begun a two-day maritime exercise in waters near the peninsula and Japan. The drill aims to detect and track ballistic missiles. The trilateral drill comes less than 2 weeks after Pyongyang test-fired a new ICBM and declared it had achieved nuclear statehood, escalating global alarm over its weapons push.
The first trilateral joint drills after the DPRK's latest ICBM launch. Aegis warships from Japan, US, and South Korea will conduct a computer simulation to follow up ballistic missiles using radar and exchange intelligence with each other. It comes as regional tensions remain high over the DPRK's refusal to curb its nuclear program. China warned that such maneuvers fueled tension following nuclear-armed Pyongyang's longest-range missile launch to date.
The situation on the Korean Peninsula is in a vicious cycle, with the characteristics of power, showing off, and confrontation. A military solution is absolutely unacceptable.
Tension surged back to the peninsula after the November 29th launch of the Hwasong-15 ICBM, which the North claimed could deliver a super-large heavy warhead anywhere on the U.S. mainland. Many analysts suggest that the rocket is capable of reaching the U.S. mainland, but doubted that Pyongyang mastered the technology needed to allow for atmospheric re-entry. Washington and Seoul staged their biggest ever joint air drill last week in a show of force against the DPRK. Pyongyang has described the exercises as the U.S. president begging for a nuclear war.
And North Korea has been very critical of the military drills when it comes to that Korea and the U.S. forces use the stealth fighters in the military drills, because those F-22 and F-35 has the capability to penetrate North Korean territory without being detected.
Very few people believe that these or other war games will halt Kim Jong-un's quest to build a functioning nuclear-tipped rocket. So the war games continue, while everyone wonders when and not if the DPRK will conduct its next missile or nuclear test.
We see two developments going on all at the same time. While Japan, South Korea and the United States are doing their military drills, the foreign ministers of Australia, Japan and also India are meeting for their annual gathering together. So many signs of different developments in the region. How should we read them? I'm joined here in Beijing by Mr. Rong Ying, Vice President of CIIS, China Institute of International Studies. Welcome back to our program, sir. Good to have you. In Washington, D.C., we have Ms. Sharon Squassoni, who is the Director and Senior Fellow of Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome back as well. And also joining us in London, we have Madhav Nalapat, who is the UNESCO Peace Chair and Director of Geopolitics and International Relations Department at Manipal University. We have a lot of topics to cover, ladies and gentlemen, so we want you to be concise and precise. Let me begin with you, Professor Nalapat. India is an active participant these days of a foreign ministers meeting. Yesterday, India was hosting one between China, India, and also some of the other countries in the region, Russia rather. And now India is hosting another one, foreign ministers meeting with Japan and also Australia. What exactly is India having in mind when it comes to the Korean Peninsula issue?
Well, I'd like to say that India's policy was one of non-alignment, which frankly did not give very many good results to India. And today, in my view, the policy is all alignment. You have very correctly said that we had a meeting with the Russian, Indian and Chinese foreign ministers. It was an extremely cordial meeting, especially between the Indian and Chinese foreign ministers. There was a lot of warmth and cordiality. And now today you have this other meeting with a different set of partners, Australia and Japan, for example. Now the reality of the situation is, so far as all these countries are concerned, every one of these countries is concerned about the situation in the Korean Peninsula. They may have differences of approach, but the objective is the same, And I think the objective of India is the objective of everybody in this list, whether it's Russia, China, Australia or Japan, which is somehow to ensure that North Korea denuclearizes.
All right. Denuclearizes through what kind of channel? That is, I guess, the most important thing. Let me go to you, Mrs. Squassoni, in Washington, D.C. We are reading different signs. The joint military exercise between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, this certainly is going to further irritate Pyongyang, as South Korea, Japan, and the United States argue that Pyongyang irritated them earlier with the weapon advancement. The other thing is the United Nations Assistant Secretary General just came back from Pyongyang once in a 6-year trip to Pyongyang. Thirdly, we also see China's so-called double suspension suggestion has been more seriously considered by both sides. Fourthly, we are seeing also the UN giving the warning that the sanctions might cause further deterioration of situation for a winter in North Korea. How should we read all of these mixed signs? Ms. Squassoni.
Well, I think Jeffrey Feltman, the UN Undersecretary, came back and said there is an urgent need to sit down and talk. And I think we should take his recommendation very seriously. It's very hard to know the impact of the sanctions on North Korea. Even Feltman, I'm sure, did not travel throughout the country, and of course what he sees will be closely restrained by the North Koreans. So we don't exactly know, whether collapse is imminent. I don't think anyone really wants a collapse of the North Korean regime. That would spell a humanitarian disaster. But in terms of these recent drills, the drills are conducted with many different objectives in mind. One is to reassure our allies, South Koreans and Japanese. The other is to test equipment. I understand the North Koreans find many of these exercises provocative, and some of them undoubtedly are. For example, decapitation exercises, right? This latest ballistic missile tracking exercise, that's a defensive maneuver, right? So I don't think that North Korea may very well find it provocative, but this particular one is not meant to be provocative. They are done to test technology, to reassure each other, and to test procedures. Okay, you got your explanation over there, Mr. Rong. Timing is the most important thing, as we all know. The United States, some of those in the policy circle, has been arguing 6 months to a year could be the time when sanctions work. To what extent it would work, they don't know. But they want to give this time so that they will figure it out. However, as we all know, that during this period of time probably is the most dangerous time, because anything could happen from any party involved. So, Mr. Rong, when you see all of these mixed messages, foreign ministers' consultations, plus joint military drills, plus tit-for-tat rhetorics, what do you say?
Indeed, we have a very sort of complicated and situated, and also I would say dangerous situations. And we certainly have the messages that is confusing or mixed. But in the meantime, we also see some positive, if I can say. And
we'd love to hear about the positive side from the Chinese side.
Of course, on the Chinese side, we have always proposed for a kind of early sort of resumption of dialogues, which I think China has already provided a roadmap working with the Russians at the suspension for suspension initiative. But
just to explain to our viewers, double suspension means that the DPRK suspend its nuclear program, weapon program. Well, the United States and South Korea, some of the other allies, they suspend any military drills or exercise programs.
That's right. Okay. Yeah, that is meant to, as a first step, to reduce the tension that has been very high on the peninsula, and could easily lead to possible miscalculations. And in the meantime, I also took notice that there are some news, as I said, for example, the visit by the Under-Secretary of UN, Mr. Feltman, could be regarded as a positive or I mean, news in some sense, because the invitation was extended by North Korea at the General Assembly in September, and finally it took place. So at least I think the first in 6 years, it is the first, I think, very important opportunity for exchanges, for communications.
But you know, the most important thing is these mixed signals. Actually, it could be both crisis on the rise and opportunities on the rise. Nobody knows. It really depends on how different parties, you know, interact with one another and believe whatever goals they have in their own mind. Nobody could know what their goals are. But this is only one part of the overall map, Mr. Rong, that we're seeing in Asia-Pacific region, for example. The DPRK issue is pretty much tied into the overall structures that different players and powers in Asia are looking at their own roles in the region and how they interact with the others, Mr. Rong. For example, the foreign ministers meeting Australia, Japan, and also India right now.
Yes, I think certainly we have to look at the bigger picture, the border context. I think the North Korea's nuclear issues is largely, primarily an issue of security. The security, I think, between the U.S. on the one hand and North Korea on the other. So I believe, and this happened in the context of the involving sort of situation, particularly I think the perceived the shifting of the balance of power.
Right.
So that's why we have seen so many diplomatic initiatives and interactions, unilateral things.
A lot. Very intense, in fact, recently. Mr. Nalapat, in that regard, I want to go to you. India was hosting these ministers' meetings, and many are looking at the people involved. You know, Australia, Japan, and India, aren't they the so-called 4 countries that's involved in what President Trump has illustrated as so-called the Indo-Pacific strategy, even though he didn't explain about that. What does India think about this, the 3 foreign ministers meeting? What are you trying to achieve this time?
Well, I'd like to say that China is a very important part of the Indo-Pacific. I mean, China is by now the 2nd largest economy in the world. It's a very important part of the Indo-Pacific. And so far as India is concerned, India is also a growing economy. And frankly, India's trade with East Asia is many times more than its trade with South Asia or even with Southeast Asia. So East Asia is extremely important economically for India. Therefore, it's quite obvious that there would be a very much stronger relationship with Japan, which is an important part of East Asia. So as I said before, India, frankly, is now entering the policy of all alignment. We are aligned with every power, in a sense, that will give a certain amount of advantage and leverage to us. On the one side, we have China and Russia. On the other side, we have Australia, Japan, and the United States. And my own personal view is that these 2 blocs are never going to come into an actual conflict with each other, for the simple reason there's so much of trade, there's so much of interaction, and there's so much dependence on each other that a war would be disastrous for all sides.
Mr. Squassoni, I want to go to you. You know, this is an interesting reflection, what we have right now, the so-called mini-lateral consultations going on, whether it's China, Russia, and India, or India, Japan, and also the Australian side. This is a sign of different countries trying to find their position after the so-called United States withdrawing from the earlier front line of diplomacy. What do you make of these mini multilateral consultations? What kind of signs are they put forward to you?
So I think it's important to remember that several of these initiatives predate Trump.
That's
right?
true.
So the foreign secretaries' meetings started in 2015. The Indo-Pacific
15
Alliance,
years ago.
you know, this is something that, right, exactly, Abe was trying to push. However, I think that, you know, the U.S., particularly President Trump, he's a wild card, right? I don't know so much that he's withdrawn leadership, but I think his foreign policy, at least as it's viewed in Washington, is perplexing, right? So that does create a bit of a vacuum for other players to move in. There is somewhat, I think, a sense that there's a need to balance China. You can look at it in a more positive light rather than simply countering China. And I think that some of the countries in the, if you want to say, use that term, Indo-Pacific region, are keen on doing that. The question is, with respect to North Korea, you know, can those different multilateral arrangements do anything? Who do the North Koreans want to talk to? They want to talk to the United States. They view the United States as a threat. And so the United States, very specifically, has to take a leadership role, but in conjunction with all the concerned states in the region. China is obviously, you know, a key player. So is South Korea and Japan. You know, South Korea is not part of this Indo-Pacific alliance, and so that's a big question. What role will they play, if any?
Mr. Rong, I want to go to you as a result. You know, many people, just as Ms. Squassoni have just asked, what exactly China wants to achieve? Well, its power is getting ever stronger and muscles certainly ever firmer. Well, at the United States, at the same time, seem to be not necessarily as evolved as they used to be in the region. What exactly is China's agenda? Should China's agenda cause concern from the others? I know you would say no, but we want to hear the reasoning behind it.
Oh, indeed. I think that this is a big question China is being asked, and China is very hard to answer. I think China has made it very clear, at least I think from political statements and so forth, that China would like to play a more proactive and constructive roles in terms of managing, handling, and resolving the hotspot issues in the region. Very recently, actually it's last weekend, Saturday, Foreign Minister Wang Yi made a very important speech at my institute, the China Institute of International Studies seminar, that China would explore a way to resolve regional hotspot issues with Chinese characteristics to maintain stability in the region. So I think China is becoming more proactive, and China is trying to be helpful. The question is that as China playing a more important role, China is becoming more proactive. Definitely, China's the influence will grow, and this is happening in the context of the perceived changing or shifting of balance of power. So for the established power like the United States, how the United States is perceiving that, but more importantly, other emerging powers or important countries in the region like India, how they would perceive.
Right.
So we have a very complicated or interesting sort of...
It's a very interesting, you know, interactions or perceptions as well among different countries. Now we are also having Yuki Tatsumi, who is joining us from Washington, D.C., even though she's originally from Japan, Senior Associate and Director of the Japan Program at the Stimson Center. Very wonderful welcome to you, Ms. Tatsumi. Japan, an important player as well today. Japanese Foreign Minister, together with some of the other countries, are having meetings in India. Japan is participating in the multilateral drills toward the DPRK. What exactly is Japan having in mind about its role? How is it interacting with, for example, China, which is neighbor?
I think Japan definitely wants to engage more in the broader regional security issues, and from that perspective, Japan's relationship with its neighbor, just like you said, China is very important. India is obviously a very important partner in the, as Prime Minister Abe proceeds with his free and open Indo-Pacific strategy together with the United States. And Australia has been Japan's probably the closest security partner beyond its bilateral alliances with the United States. So yes, Japan has a lot of stake in this whole regional strategic development.
But on the other hand, how are we going to kill those misperceptions that we have toward one another? Because it's going to be very dangerous. It would eventually reflect upon our policies toward one another in the region, which is at a time when all powers are evolving in the region. Let's go to Ms. Tatsumi once again, because you're joining us a little bit late. We want to give you more airtime.
I appreciate that. I think what Japan is interested in is upholding the universal norms and the international order that has been set and that has contributed to the prosperity in the not only in the Asia-Pacific but broader Indo-Pacific and then also globally. So I think that is a crux of Japan's interest in now reaching out to countries with the United States and other security partners like Australia and India under this strategy of a free and open Indo-Pacific.
All right. We only got 1.5 minutes left for the four of you, four very deep thinkers about the current situation in the Asia-Pacific region. But each of you have 30 seconds, I guess. Help us to understand what will be the role that your country is likely to play in this evolving chess game. Let's go to Mr. Nalapat first. 30 seconds, sir.
Well, I'd like to say that India is interested in economic growth, and India is interested in peace and stability throughout Asia. And frankly, for that means working closely with Japan, working closely with China, working closely with the United States. All these countries trade extensively with each other. They have extensive linkages with each other. So I really don't see why any of these countries should see the other as a threat.
Ms. Natsumi, Japan.
Very much in line with what our friends from India said. Japan is interested in working with all the countries that are open to working with Japan, with other security partners to maintain a free and open and liberal international order.
Got your three key words. Ms. Squassoni, U.S.?
Well, I think the U.S. certainly supports the rule of law and freedom of navigation. The question is, you know, can the U.S. play a very constructive role, not just with those allies in the region, but also with China, to make sure that China's considerations are also taken into account in all of this.
Last but not least, Mr. Rong Ying, Beijing.
Yes, China has been playing a very important role proactively, and China will continue to play the role because this region has enjoyed peace and stability and prosperity, and China feels that it has a responsibility to play the role, working together with all the countries in the region.
Sounds like everybody wants to work with everybody. That is only a good sign to me as a TV host, but we hope things will go as you just said. Thank you so much for all of you for being with us. Rong Ying, Sharon Squassoni, and Yuki Tatsumi, as well as Madhav Nalapat. Thank you so much for being with us.